Good afternoon, or maybe good evening to everybody. Thanks for coming. Um, I think it's any end of day session actually requires us to be funny, perky, all of those things so that the audience doesn't fall asleep. So hopefully we can keep this as informal as we possibly can. And as usual, we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you can keep your questions ready for that, that'll be great. So Nisha, let me start with you. So I just got off a plane to be on this panel because I had to vote yesterday. So obviously I have a strong view on the Indian elections. But I'm curious as to how you, as an outsider who's heavily invested in India, sees the election. What's your read of what's going on?
Well, this is clearly a very interesting election that is being watched not only in India, but frankly around the world. And I would say that what is being watched is not so much who wins the election, which is obviously very important, but which India emerges at the conclusion of this election. You've seen a prime minister coming in 2014 for the first time in almost 4 decades with a single party majority and a mandate for economic reform. And I think that Prime Minister Modi is to be commended for some very significant reforms that have happened during his tenure, and for the way in which I think he has really marketed India as open for business and a place for investment. You've seen FDI increase, you've seen the growth rates increase, but you've also seen in the last 12 months or so an India that's turned inward a little bit. Mm-hmm. Some feelings of anti-incumbency in some of the state elections. Some feeling that the economic reforms that have taken place haven't yet resulted in benefits, particularly at the bottom of the pyramid, whether it's the farmers or the small traders. And so some of the policies in the past year have sought to perhaps address or appease some of those domestic constituencies, which has also created some concerns in the international investor community on, will India continue on a path of liberalization and reform post-election? Or will India turn more inward and think more about kind of a more protectionist approach to its economic trajectory? We heard, I think, earlier in the day, a panel, Mark Penn was on a panel talking about the U.S. elections, but he talked about Narendra Modi as a new economy nationalist, which is a bit of a contradiction in and of itself as well. And so, I think that's what everyone's looking for, is which India comes out of these elections.
So when you say two Indias, you mean an outward-looking India and an inward-looking India?
India Inc. versus Bharat.
Okay. And do you have a prognosis on the election?
I mean, I think that the conventional wisdom would say that Narendra Modi will come back, that he may come back with fewer seats than he did in 2014 and perhaps need to form a coalition. But we all learned an important lesson in the United States in 2016, which is things may not necessarily be as they seem when you're going into the polls. And so I think we're all paying close attention to what is announced on the 23rd.
Okay. Secretary Jaishankar, do you actually agree with Nisha's prognosis? You've actually been inside of this government as well. So as a sort of insider who's now on the outside, what's your read of the elections?
Well, okay. Let me make 2 broad points. One, and both in a sense picking up on where Nisha left off. Look, one is a very interesting relationship between politics and economics in India. Because in most countries, I mean, I'd say pretty much everywhere in the world, people first actually built their economy before they allowed universal voting. We are the only case that I know of, at least a significant case to the contrary. And with the first elections when they were held, life expectancy would have been below 35. Literacy would have been around 10% the first time elections were held. And yet you actually have had 17 elections which have been free, fair, accepted. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm making that point because democracy came first, in a way. Generally in India, politics still now has trumped economics. That in a lot of other societies, you debate, in India, it's not the economy stupid. It's often it's the polity stupid. Okay. Now, the two are beginning to catch up with each other because I think today this election is going to see something like 85 million first-time voters, very aspirational, who think today that health, housing, electricity, it's their right. Now, this was not the view in India 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago. So you actually have a kind of a changing electorate in many ways, which will therefore throw up outcomes which cannot be modeled on the basis of previous political numbers. The second point is this, because most people would look, because politics in most countries is binary. You have Republicans and Democrats. So people transpose that onto other countries. Now, in a kind of way, that's not wrong in India, but the two big parties, the BJP and Congress, actually account for about 50% of the votes. So roughly half the votes. Imagine an American election where the Republicans and Democrats only account for half the votes. And the rest of the electoral college is split between, 40 other parties. So why I say that is a lot of politics, therefore, is local. What are the alliances, who goes with whom, what's the turnout, whether there's a national issue which will trump local issues. So there are a lot of moving parts in this election. So in terms of prognosis, all I can tell you is if you look back, at least in the last 5, 6, 7 elections, pretty much everybody got the election wrong to some degree. So now I'm not saying what she says is wrong. I'm just saying that it's actually election forecasting is a very brave business in India.
Yeah, the heterogeneity alone is too high.
And every 5 years, there are so many new factors. Even 4 rounds out of 7 have been held. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the first time that you've had more women voting in India than men. Now, what the consequence of that is, we don't know. 85 million first-time voters, we don't know how they'll vote. You've had probably about 100 million people who in the last 5 years have received direct benefits from the government which they never got before. Now, will that impact their electoral behavior? We don't know. So I think there are so many don't knows because so many things have changed in the last 5 years.
But I think the point that you make about the false binary is actually a very interesting one, because I think a lot of the time we are trying to force fit a sort of presidential model onto a parliamentary system.
Correct.
Right? And you shouldn't expect a presidential outcome out of a parliamentary system. That's effectively what you're saying. Okay. Ravi, do you have any, I know you're at some distance from India now. You're based in New York. Do you watch the elections? I know maybe we are taking the election conversation too far, but it's just too juicy to leave it on the table. Do you have a view at all, or?
I think they've pretty much summarized what.
Okay. So let me just pick up on something on the sort of business environment conversation. Let me just go to Jayne first. Jayne, you run a business and you've operated both in India as well as China. Obvious question, what's it like? What's the differences between the two countries as far as you're concerned, running a global business in Asia in both of these countries?
Thanks, Reuben. So traveling between both of the two countries, the thing I can say for sure is I'm an expert on neither, because it's impossible to spend enough time in either one. But
should be admitting these things on a panel. It's being recorded live.
I think it's important to admit that. But I think
you like the Chinese food or the Indian food?
I like both.
Oh my God, this is way too diplomatic.
No, but I think interestingly enough, business sort of always manages to come through. And if we look at things like the growth rate, so I work in the insurance industry, and I look at the growth rate of both of these markets. So in the Indian market, we project 7% growth rate over the next years, and Chinese market is 6%. So we see a very similar growth rate of the underlying business. But there's other areas where I think it's quite different. So if we look at things like sort of just the basic connectivity and infrastructure of doing business in the two different places. I've been traveling to both for many years now, and you can always just tell by the new airports that come in. So I think India's now has quite a nice airport system. Certainly the Mumbai airport is quite nice, but if you think back to a few years, it was quite different. But I think in terms of things like the connectivity of the internet and the ability to do business in a very consistent way, I think that's a bit of a difference in an area where India can catch up a bit more to China. But having said all of that, I think one of the biggest benefits of India is, and everybody knows it, the demographic dividend that it has. So we see all the other countries of Asia aging quite a bit. So China's aging, much differently than India. India has a young population, and I think that's maybe one of the biggest opportunities for India is the chance to look towards Japan and towards China and see this kind of aging population and how to deal with it, but at the same time harness the advantage of having this younger generation or younger population in India.
So, I mean, the only sort of clarification to put on the table there is that the demographic dividend is constantly spoken about, but if you break it down, you will see China-like problems in some states of India, and you'll see a very different India depending on where you look. So Bihar has a median age of 19, and Tamil Nadu has a median age of 31. So it's actually very hard to... Ravi, let me sort of come to you on the same question, sort of, India, fastest growing economy in the world, certainly major economy in the world today. What do you think the country needs to do to sustain growth? I mean, so, I think we should just take a step back and just ask ourselves the question of how many countries in the world have grown for 30 years at 6%, right? That right there is a very, very small number when you think across time. So at some level, India has already pulled off a miracle by growing for so long at 5-6%. So what does it need to do to sustain the growth?
So that's a great question, Reuben, and I had a very short answer for the previous one. I'm going to have a slightly longish answer for this. Sure. And it's a complex paradox to answer that question. And India is a pretty, in many ways, a confluence of paradoxes in a way. The opportunity for India to cater to a global market is broadly driven on three factors. The demographic dividend, which Jayne spoke about, not just the demographic changes in the country, but demographic changes across the world. The second is the pace at which globalization happens and there is free flow of capital and goods. And I would say the third is the embrace of new age digital or Industry 4.0 technologies, as we call it, and the ramifications of it as work moves between different countries in the world. And that's in a transition now. So let's step back and look at the context. India creates roughly around 5 million jobs a year. And it kind of adds 17 million people into the job market every year. Growing at 6% for the last 5 years, higher per capita, lower poverty has still not actually bridged that gap. And in fact, unemployment is actually one of the highest now in India in the last few years.
Depends on whose numbers.
Depends on whose numbers, but still it is in the range of 6%. Nobody is going to debate whether it is low. You're going to debate whether it is 6 or 7 or 8, but it is still high. And I think the biggest challenge for India now is, if you look at it sectorially, and I'm going to cut it down sectorially to just make my point, you're going to have different nuances India has to work with to capitalize on the opportunity, provided these three catalysts I spoke about work in favor of India. Let's take the IT and business process industry. Roughly around 3 million people work in it, so very small in comparison to the size of the,
But what's the multiplier on that?
The multiplier is very high, but it gives you much lesser impact. And I'm using the lens and the pivot of jobs to tell you what the opportunity is.
Sure.
You could use multiple pivots. GDP is a pivot, but I'm using jobs as a pivot to look at inclusivity and, in some sense, shared prosperity. So, the IT sector is going through significant transformation. More agile work, faster sprints, lesser number of people are moving between countries. So you're going to see, in some sense, it's not going to give you a big impact. It's only 3 million jobs. How much can you do in the next 5 or 6 years? But having said that, it has a much higher per capita, it has a multiplier, it has indirect employment, so it's important. And 50% of the global tech services workforce actually is out of India now, almost. So if India invests heavily on reskilling to digital capabilities, the opportunity continues to remain there. So I'm just going sector by sector. The second is agriculture. 50% of the workforce of India actually works in agriculture. And there is almost an upward movement of people from agriculture to other sectors because the per capita incomes are so low.
Yeah, and productivity is very
Productivity is very low. And after the Green Revolution, India has really not done much on agricultural productivity so that you could keep back that workforce there. So that's an area India has to work on. So I'm kind of talking about what India has to do to leverage on this opportunity. It's very fascinating. I was talking on a panel last day. The future of work is going to move from private human capital to private human capital, public human capital, and machines. And public human capital is this gig economy around us. India has literally 50% of the online public human capital of the world. Almost 29 million people are available on.
Is that availability or actual work? I mean,
So it is availability, and that's why I said it depends on whether those 3 accelerators help you to get there. If there is globalization, there is free flow of goods and work, you would probably get there. So that opportunity is there. There is internal consumption inside the country because a significant part of India is unorganized, and you have an opportunity to organize the unorganized. And I would think all the unorganized sector is going to get Uberized in a way, if I may want to use the word Uberized. And that will give you an opportunity for internal consumption as well as catering to the world. I think the world is going to move from private human capital to private plus public plus machines, and India can play a role there. Manufacturing is going through a reshoring across the world. Manufacturing is coming back to the United States. It's coming back to Germany. In fact, if you look at per capita robots, if you look at the density of robots, Korea and Japan are ahead of China. If India can play a role there, it can actually be the manufacturing hub for the reshoring which is happening, and there is movement of work, as I said. It could have an opportunity there. And that opportunity kind of exists if India can play on automation and autonomous technologies in the shop floor, which is the Industry 4.0 technologies I'm talking about. I think all countries are running behind it. Whoever actually gets it well will probably move work out of China in some sense. China is actually kind of losing a little bit there. Then there is textiles. I can go on. Each of these industries
I want
have
to pick up on something you just said and bring it to you, Jay, which is the question of the fundamental sort of development model, right? So there's been this sort of understanding that typically you move surplus labor out of agriculture, they move into manufacturing, and then they upskill themselves into services. Now, that is not what has happened in India. We have a very large services sector and a very small manufacturing sector. So is this a model that is uniquely Indian in the sense of we've actually moved to a completely different paradigm? What's your sort of view on the development paradigm that is evolving, number one? And number two, why is it that India is unable to take advantage of the jobs that are leaving China, right? Because of high wages in China. Most of that seems to be going to Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, but not to us.
Look, I'm in agreement with everything Ravi said, except that I think there's one fundamental sort of gap, which actually explains why you're not generating enough jobs and why we have the challenges we do. And it is this. Look at our human development indices. Okay. A lot of other Asian countries moved early on education and health, on literacy and health. We moved relatively late. So I would say today, if you were to look at when you ask a question, what's the developmental model of India? I think it's a hodgepodge. Okay, it's a mix of this and a mix of that, with a lot of shortcomings which you're trying to remedy today. I mean, in a simplistic sense, I would say, what we've seen in the last few years is a kind of East Asia corrective that has been introduced into the Indian society. So you have these campaigns, I give you the most obvious one, which is, if you don't have, to get women in workplace, you need women in school. And to get women in school, you need toilets for girls. So there's a kind of chain out there. So I think today how India does in terms of its numbers in meeting sustainable development goal targets, like China met the Millennium Development Goal targets. I think that's a very, you need that social churning, you need that fast tracking through public awareness programs, through government exhortation. Because if you don't get your HR right, mass HR right, I think then to build castles on a flawed foundation will only give you limited results.
But again, we are running into the, sorry, go ahead.
Now the manufacturing, the China bit, so if you were to ask me, so what needs to be done? Obviously, at the bottom of the pyramid, you got to fix the human development indices. Then you have to do it the old-fashioned way. I mean, clearly we have today infrastructure deficits. One of the reasons why jobs are not relocating out of, businesses are not relocating out of China to India is because you can see the infrastructure gap. I mean, the cost of labor is only one issue in all of that. So you have to do what it takes to attract manufacturing to make that the movement, the economy more efficient. So there's clearly the orthodox things which East Asia and Southeast Asia did, which you have to do. Then within India, I think there are practical issues, I mean, which are not structural issues, but things like, say, the GST. I mean, if you have every state having its own taxes and barriers in between, that's a huge inefficiency that you have introduced. Now, by doing GST, you actually, for example, reduced trucking of goods by about 70%, 65, 70%. I mean, what could take 20 days to go from end to end is today taking 5 days. That's a huge internal efficiency you've introduced, particularly at a time when e-commerce is beginning to take root in India. And I think finally, even if you were to move people out, you have to look at the aspirational generation today. It's not just jobs they want a certain quality of jobs. So I think you need to promote a startup culture as well. So if you were to today say, okay, so what's the Indian model? I would say it's all of the above.
But see, so on this, let's take the startup culture as an example. So there's a top line endorsement of the fact that you need a startup culture.
Right.
But nobody seems to be willing to do the sort of hard work that is required to actually get a genuine startup culture going. Because on the one hand, you have a startup culture. The other hand, we have got venture capitalists in the room. They get hit with an angel tax. So it's like different arms of the government itself seem to be working at cross purposes with each other.
So you have to look at what happened in Silicon Valley to create that startup
Yes.
culture and what can be replicated in India, right? You had the R&D, and then you had the ability to commercialize that R&D.
Yes.
And then you had the regulatory environment that allowed that commercialization to scale up.
Yes.
And, in India, what I hear from startups, it's not the access to capital, it's the ecosystem
Yes.
Yeah.
that allows them
Exactly.
to grow and to scale and to reach profitability.
Yeah, but I think the challenge is this. Because you have the economy at different stages, so often what's the cutting edge of the economy encounters an obstacle somewhere with a part of the bureaucracy or part of policy which is actually geared, which is looking at it with a perspective which is 30 years old. Okay, so this is a challenge. I mean, just sort of saying it, leadership saying, let's do startups, not going to make the entire system come to heel.
So let's think about this question differently. Are we thinking of India at the wrong scale? So what I mean by that is there a genuine case to be made for massive decentralization? So that a lot more decisions can actually be taken where they need to be taken, as opposed to, this is the problem with aggregate numbers, right? I mean, the aggregate numbers don't tell you the story. So even on some of the issues that you mentioned, there's a huge gap between parts of the country and other parts of the country. So why wouldn't it make sense to have a genuine federal polity, like say the United States, where you actually have a lot more decision making at the state level?
Look, again, I don't think centralization is a solution to this problem.
Decentralization.
Centralization is the problem here. I mean, in fact, if you didn't have centralization, it's today your central authority, which is the most progressive part of the system, which is exhorting the rest of the system, saying, guys, change. Okay. If you decentralize, there's no guarantee that the decentralized bits will be as progressive and as change embracing as you would imagine. So I'm not sure I see this as a centralization decentralization problem. I think there are a number of issues here. Part of it is vision, awareness, a willingness to kind of take the risks to forge new kinds of economic activities. Which would mean departure from a lot of habits and a lot of vested interests. At the same time, I think there are other issues in certain areas. There are capability issues. I mean, I think the Indian state definitely needs to build up its capability. Yes. I think there are skills issues. There are HR issues. But today, if you don't encourage the right kind of skills, training. I'm not even talking retraining here. How do you make this work? So I wouldn't simplify it in terms of too much authority, and so why don't you let go some of that and it'll fix itself? I think you need clearly someone at the top with strong vision, strong beliefs, strong messaging. You need a whole system and a bigger system and a stronger system which responds to that. It's all easier said than done. I mean, the good news is, if you ask me, is there change year on year? Of course there is. Is the change fast enough, responsive enough? Answer, I think, is in our conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm reminded of Montek Singh Ahluwalia's famous line about, in India, there's a strong consensus for weak reforms. But let me just pick up on this human capital question and bring it back to you, Ravi. So I've been to the Infosys Mysore campus, which is, to me, it's a fascinating thing where you literally are, you're taking a whole bunch of young, I'm guessing, engineers, and you're retraining them at some level. You're teaching them soft skills, a whole bunch of things. How do you think about this human capital issue, which is critical for your industry?
Absolutely. So what happened in the tech services space with companies like Infosys was we ran a finishing school infrastructure in India, where we knew that the academic ecosystem only will get you some runway, and you actually build the balanced runway to make them productive. And then, every other firm in India actually created that ecosystem, and we orchestrated it in a very good way to create technology talent which did not exist in India. I think the challenge now, if you really want to again pivot on jobs and look at it in terms of progress, the unorganized sector doesn't have anything equivalent to it. The IT and the business process management services sector would add around 300,000 jobs a year. You have to actually get to at least 10 million jobs a year. That can only happen if you can get the unorganized sector organized enough and create orchestration on incubation centers, startup ecosystems you spoke about. There are like 4,000 or 5,000 tech startup ecosystems. You don't see that in other parts of the value chain. Apprentice models, which I think at some point of time India did that well, but we kind of lost that. And that's very critical. because vocational jobs and apprentices are much bigger virtue in the economy now than white collar jobs. If I want to make a distinction between white and blue collar jobs, I don't want to, but if you want to, but in the new economy, there are only going to be new collar jobs. They're not going to be white or blue collar jobs. And I don't think that ecosystem is fully done. If you really look at it,
But
that's where the short supply is.
But let me just pick on that point. Is there a cultural dimension here? Because I mean, today, if you drive an Uber in India, you're likely to make about 5 times more money than, say, somebody who's got a commerce degree. Is there this fascination for white-collar jobs at the expense of blue-collar jobs that's causing part of the
So
problem?
that's because there isn't enough skilling happening at the end, and that is why they take the least resistance path of actually taking an Uber job, because that's the easiest to be skilled. Now, if you really look at, if you take a cut of all the gaps between the 5 million jobs and the 15 to 17 million who are available, it's a paradox. We need jobs of the future. The jobs of the past are going away. There is a reskilling needed in the middle. And I don't think either the government or the institutions or the individuals who are actually at an economic prosperity where they cannot actually, run through that finishing school, anybody has actually dealt with that. So that's the biggest gap. In fact, STEM students in India is roughly around 2.5 million in a year. It's second largest after China. China churns out 4 million. US churns out 500,000.
What's the quality?
There the unemployment rate is much higher than the unemployment rate for technicians, the unemployment rate for plumbers, the unemployment rates for manufacturing shop floor workers. Why is it that we are still not able to do it? Because there isn't anybody who's taking the finishing line like Infosys did to create the talent. And I think it's a concerted joint effort. The governments, the academic institutions, and organizations have to come together to make it. And that to me will only be that's the only way you can actually bridge that gap. You will not bridge that gap if you cannot actually build that traditional apprentice model to build traditional jobs with an embrace of technology in it.
And I suspect that this is where we'll come back to the state capability issue all over again. Jayne, let me come to you on this sort of related issue around human development, which is so obviously one of the most miraculous bits about the India-China story over the past many decades has been the fact that so many hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. However, the people who have been lifted out of poverty are typically just one step away from falling back into poverty. And typically, the main culprit tends to be health shocks. And this is where insurance can actually be a very interesting tool in the mix. What's your view about, and certainly about preventing people from falling back into poverty?
So in many of the panels during these days, people talk about this, all the people who've been lifted out of poverty, which is terrific achievement. But I always ask the question, how do we keep them out of poverty? Because that's the second question that has to come after once they've been lifted out. Or how do we keep moving them to the next economic class over time? And it comes from job skills and things like that. But it also comes from creating this ability that they can bounce back after they've had some sort of terrible cost. So healthcare costs are one of the biggest reasons, that the largest driver for people to move back into poverty or to move back down an economic class, because they get a very expensive healthcare bill and they can't pay it. So they either can't do their job anymore or they just simply can't pay the bill. And that's where insurance does come in. And I think when we look across all the sort of countries where we talk about alleviating poverty and moving people up economic classes, one of the most important things to think about is how do we protect their assets? Because as economies develop and people develop, they accumulate more assets. And those assets are physical assets, they're financial assets, they're human assets. But they have to be protected, because otherwise we just go backwards again after there's a fire that puts a business under, or a healthcare claim, as we said. So I think building these kind of insurance mechanisms at all levels that can help people to first pre-fund for these disasters that might come, but then also be able to bounce back after they've had a really terrible loss. And we have examples like that all over. at the personal level, but also at the governmental level, where many governments think about pre-funding the kind of disasters they might see in the future.
And what's your experience in India been? I mean, so we've talked about this before, but it's this whole business of you've got to have something to lose in the first place to want insurance, right? I mean, and has India got to that stage where you're seeing an uptake of insurance?
Well, so it's increasing, but we still have an insurance penetration of something like 3.5%, which is really, really low, and there's plenty of room to move. But that comes back to financial literacy as well. So how do we educate more people about why it's important, not just to buy insurance, but also to save and to manage their finances? But it comes back to sort of the education system, and how do we get enough people to understand why it's important to protect those assets?
Well, that's one part of it. The other part of it is mis-selling. Because you see a lot of insurance being, I mean, financial products in general being missold to in a highly information asymmetric environment.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the challenges is we tend to sell kind of complex products in a lot of places, which opens itself to being sold in the wrong way. So one of the advantages I've seen in China in particular already is the chance to sort of break different coverages down into more bite-sized pieces. So make a simplified product that's easier for people to understand and that can be sold in a digital fashion. Because if you want to sell a digital product, it has to be done in a more simplified way. And I think that's also an opportunity for India over time.
And surely the regulatory environment needs work, I'm guessing. I mean, what are the changes you'd like to see? I mean, the Prime Minister Modi takes great pride in the fact that India has gone up in the ease of business rankings of the World Bank. What are the big changes you'd like to see?
I think, I think all governments take time, and regulation is something that's always easy to complain about, but it exists for a reason. But I think just purely speed would be the first thing I would wish for, Reuben. So just a faster implementation of regulatory policies.
Okay. I think we're just going back to the state capability question and the ability of the state. Nisha, maybe we can just pull out a little bit and take a little bit more of a macro view. So, I mean, sometime in the next couple of weeks, India is either overtaken or is in the process of overtaking the UK to become the fifth largest economy on the planet. From your vantage point, what does the emergence of India really mean? I mean, and especially from an American point of view, I mean, how do you view this, the emergence of India as a big economic power?
Look, I mean, I think the United States has always had kind of the long bet on India and India's rise. That India's rise is going to be important to the United States, important from the strategic and geopolitical sense, but also important from the economic sense. And I think with the United States and India, you have enormous opportunities. You think about innovation economies, democracies, and essentially a sense that we can work in more collaborative ways to create win-win opportunities that serve both our peoples and our markets. And I think in that sense, India's emergence, it has been going on for some time. I will say that over the past 4 or 5 years, you have seen far more bullish interest in India. And as I talk to some of the sovereign rating agencies, and I ask them, you know, as I mentioned, there's apprehension about some of the policies of the past 10 months. On the other hand, when I say, what's the bright spot in the global economy? Without fail, India is at the top of that list.
Okay. Jay, what's your view on this? I mean, and especially if you wear your previous hat, I mean, how do you see India? Leading power, balancing power, how do you see India's role in the world?
Okay, before I come there, let me just walk back a little bit to some of the issues.
Sure.
Look, my own sense is that if India is to embrace change more forcefully, with less reservations, I mean, first of all, you need a leadership with vision. Okay. I mean, to my mind, you use that word decentralization. I think, in fact, the issue for us is there are too many people who are apathetic or agnostic, and which combined with weak capabilities are not giving us the results we want. So when I use that word East Asia corrective, I mean, in East Asia, you didn't change economy by decentralizing. You changed it by very strong leadership, by giving clear, messages to the system, by building the capabilities which would go and bring about change out there. So I think for us today, those are in many ways the key public administration issues that we sort of need to look at. Now, if you look what's happening in the society, you actually have today an economy which is 3 trillion minus, heading towards a 5 trillion track. And that's roughly where I would say, top of the head, China would be around 2006 or so,
Yes.
2005, 2006.
2006. Yeah.
Okay. So you look at the demands, and the population sizes are roughly the same. So if you were to say, okay, why, what Nisha said, why do people see India as a bright spot? Because I think they are actually beginning to bet on the Indian consumer. I mean, what you have seen in the last few years is a much sharper interest in getting into the Indian market, because people see pretty much some variant of what happened in China in that 2006-2010 period is going to happen in India in the next 5 years, give or take some technology changes. And it's obviously, therefore, very interesting for people to take up positions in the Indian market. Now, for the Indian market, the issue is this: how do you leverage that external interest? Because, one of our objectives, for example, was to promote Make in India. But now, the issue is not just Make in India, but what kind of vision did you have in relationship to the world? Because if you had a closed vision, then Make in India kind of becomes Make for India. Whereas if your vision is more open, then Make in India becomes Make in India for the rest of the world. So are you willing to be part of the global supply chain? Are you willing to adjust policies and practices to accommodate that? I think these are all issues that whoever comes to power in May will have to look at. I think in that sense, we are on a cusp today that, you've kind of coasted along, as you said, 30 years of 6% growth. But, at some stage, this can't run on a sort of on automatic.
Well, that's one. And
You
the
need
other-
a sort of manual shift of gears and...
Right, and
That's right.
and the other thing is whether the challenges India faces requires not 6% growth, but 10% growth.
No, absolutely. I mean, who would dispute that?
Yeah.
But the question is, what do you do to get there? How much of your current practices are you willing to break with? Who is now to do all that? You need somebody out there, strong, willing to take risks, giving that message, sort of pushing it through the system. It's not going to happen with God and gravity. So, I mean, that's. I think today
the one other metric India kind of keeps measuring themselves on is gross domestic product. And in my view, that is not going to give you an indication of how inclusive the growth is, because and that's why if you look at most of the developed nations in the world, jobs is the real indication of how your economy is doing. In some ways, I think we have to switch to that. 10% GDP could happen, but it may not be inclusive growth, and that would be a much bigger worry, because the gap between the jobs you're creating to the jobs you need, because going back to what Jayne said, the average, the median age of India is going to go down. It's 29 or so, and it's probably going to go 26. It's probably going to go down to 25, and you need more of that. And once you do that, there is going to be an acceleration of consumerism. There's going to be an acceleration of urbanization, which has not happened yet to a big extent, and that's going to trigger, local consumption, where China had an issue for a couple of years on local consumption. So I do think that's a metric we have to start thinking about.
But in all of these challenges, there lie enormous opportunity.
Absolutely.
And that's what I think is so exciting about India in the global
Yeah, I
economy
mean,
right now.
look, you can look at things as inefficiency or you can look at it as an opportunity, right? And I think if you take the view that every inefficiency in India is an opportunity.
Well, it's just the massive infrastructure boom
Yes.
that India is.
I mean, just
is
urbanization
undergoing.
alone, just, just
absolutely.
managing
Urbanization is one of the
Massive growth
No,
in
no,
education.
I mean, look, the whole consumer, I mean, you look today at exactly what happens when people hit that level of income. I mean,
Yep.
travel, tourism, consumables, and particularly in India, because you have such a differentiation. I mean, just connecting households to electricity is going to give rise to a new set of demands, which
Yep.
right now the economy doesn't factor. But the only comment I would have is, look, I agree, inclusive growth is very important. But the problem is somewhere we shouldn't lose sight of growth.
Yep, that's true.
You need growth first
Yeah,
before
you need
have
growth,
inclusion.
but
So you haven't answered my question about the larger strategic question, though. So that's one.
Yeah.
And let me just sort of add one more point there, which is sort of regional integration, right? Because anytime you have a powerful economy, ideally the region should prosper
right.
Yeah,
by
right.
tagging on to the big, powerful economy. Unfortunately, if you look at the trade numbers in South Asia, they're abysmal.
Yes.
What can be done about that?
Very quickly, look, I think in terms of where is it we would position ourselves in the world, I don't think it's so much how India would position itself. I think there will be situations, circumstances. I mean, given what is happening today in the US and given the nature of China, there are going to be a whole lot of global problems for which when you ring up the 911 number, there's nobody at the other end of the phone.
Yes.
So I think we're going to have to get used to the fact that many regions will have to help themselves. You're already seeing it in the last 5 years when you had an earthquake in Nepal, when you had civil war in Yemen, when you have natural disasters in Sri Lanka. Frankly, today the regional powers have to come and step up, which is very different from what happened in 2004 when the tsunami took place. So I think India is stepping up, will step up more. I think the expectations of the world will push India, and you just saw that in Mozambique. I mean, most people don't know when you had these, these weather disasters in Mozambique. We were one of the first to go in there. The regional issue, I agree with you. I think partly, I mean, to some extent, it's a Pakistan issue. Pakistan opposes regional trade with India and connectivity with India. So we are under-connected, we are under-trading.
But that's no reason for us to have low trade numbers with Sri Lanka.
No, sure, I agree. So I think today, how to create a more integrated regional economy, that is today a big focus. And in my view, the best way of doing that is India will have to lead the connectivity drive. Because a lot of it is regional infrastructure inefficiencies. Yes. So we have to be generous, we have to be non-reciprocal, we've got to allow our neighbors unfair access. But to my mind, that's part of creating a bigger market. And if you look in terms of actually the benefits to India, I mean, just look at the number of Nepalis, for example, who are working in the Indian economy. The number of, I think the largest number of visas issued anywhere in the world is by the Indian embassy in Bangladesh. Because the number of people who come today to avail of medical services in India is huge. So I think it's in our interest to actually, frankly, one-sided, generous, reach out to the neighbors, but provided the neighbors are in the zone of civilization and willing to respond.
Okay, I'll come to the audience in just a bit for questions, but let me just ask you one last question, Ravi, which is all of this conversation has been about multinationals coming to India, foreign businesses coming to India. You are an MNC out of India.
Yeah.
What's that experience been like? What are the cautionary lessons, I mean, if any?
Sure. So, I'll keep it short so that you get a chance to take questions from the audience. In the last 2 years, Infosys as a company took this culture of lifelong learning and replicated that whole infrastructure in the United States. So we've hired like 9,000 plus local Americans from schools and colleges. We have not traded talent, we've created talent. And that comes from the virtue of lifelong learning, which to me is the most important attribute of the digital economy. You are going to move from education to work on a linear equation to a continuum of lifelong learning. And when you do that, I think Indian multinationals culturally have an innate desire, they're kind of ingrained that way. So that's a strength Indian global multinationals can actually bring to the table when they actually work in big, developed markets like the U.S. So we are one of the best examples. We are the largest recruiter from schools in the United States in the last 1 year, and that's because we just went back to our roots and replicated
What's that number approximately?
So we've hired 9,500 in the last 2 years.
Okay.
And we have hired from colleges and schools. We have repurposed and reskilled and refactored talent. So that's a big takeaway for me. It's the rise of the Indian multinational as well as the rise of the Indian global professionals. In a very big way, not just in the tech sector, but across sectors in developed markets like the United States. I think the second important aspect, which I am so fascinated about the Indian innovation ecosystem, is reverse innovation. Addressing the bottom of the pyramid, or almost reverse innovation as you call it. And the innovation which goes into it, which is primarily around frugal innovation, is so important for the world, for shared prosperity again, that I believe the world can actually benefit out of Indian multinationals who have a presence outside of India. That to me is a huge takeaway. Indian multinationals also are exceptionally good on scaling something from concept to a large impact. So the ability to take a concept to scale, because you could experiment it domestically and take it to scale, and you've kind of ingrained that way, I think that's a very big strength of Indian multinationals. So anything you find as an opportunity or a gap, you can scale it in a big way. And that whole journey of scaling, I think Indian multinationals are pretty good at it.
Okay. Audience questions. I literally can't see anyone, so yeah, okay. Tom has a question here. Anyone else with questions?
Just picking up on Ravi's thread about GDP not being the right metric. We also spent some time on formal unemployment numbers too, and I'm just wondering, you can solve employment by creating further underemployment, and where in the, I don't know if you've done work at the Institute, Reuben, but where in the numbers are you actually accounting for underemployment? And yeah. If you actually, take whatever 6 or 8% unemployment, right? If you were to unpack that, and you just think about adding an extra guy at the toll booth or an elevator operator, right? What do you think the real number actually looks like?
And just one observation there. I didn't say GDP is not the right indicator. I'm just saying it's not the only measure on which you could measure the health of an economy.
So the very quick response, I shouldn't be doing this as a moderator, but the very quick response to your question is whether it's a jobs problem or a wages problem, right? So we may be misdiagnosing a wages problem as a jobs problem, which I suspect is what is actually going on, is underemployment, not unemployment. So it's more to do with...
And a lot of informal employment.
Yeah, so the aspiration of people and where the jobs are available is where I think the mismatch is. And that is actually underemployment.
And I think, as Jaishankar mentioned, I don't think there are any large economies in the world which have 90% unorganized sector. That has to balance out at some point of time.
Yes, there's a question there. And a question at the back as well. Is that you, Rory? Oh my goodness, I can see you. So,
has there been any success in the government collecting more tax revenues? And the follow-up to that is sort of like we have the problem here, since infrastructure is such a big issue, what's happening? Why isn't there more going into infrastructure? Whether it's transport, pollution, energy, et cetera.
Who are you addressing that question to? To the
Okay. I think on the tax revenue side, I can tell you yes. I have some numbers somewhere on my phone, but I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is both the number of people paying tax and the tax compliance has gone up very sharply, and the tax base has gone up, the revenue base has gone up, and part of that has been because of the formalization of the economy, the fact that much more of it is through banking channels. On the issue of why isn't there more investment in the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, Again, I think there's been there are a whole lot of process challenges as well. I mean, you had a whole lot of projects which were blocked. So unclogging many of those projects itself has taken some time. But clearly, there's a very strong case. I don't know if you want to say anything.
Well, I think, first of all, there is a lot happening in the infrastructure space. A lot of roads being built, a lot of airports being built. It's probably the fastest growing or the top 2 aviation markets in the world. All of that is happening because the infrastructure is getting put in. I think the point is, though, that there's such a massive deficit, right? The statistic that sticks with me is that 80% of the infrastructure of India of 2030 has yet to be built. And that gives you a sense of the scale of infrastructure. So it's not that it's not happening. It is happening. It's happening actually at a fairly impressive clip with subway systems coming in, et cetera. But you're going to see a lot more of it. And that's where I think there's a massive opportunity in India.
In fact, most of the jobs are added in that sector. Majority of the jobs are actually added on the infrastructure sector. And I actually think it could accelerate more if we can actually fill the gap of the workforce. And that's the point I was originally making. I don't think the gap is actually for engineers or computer science graduates or anything. The gap really is in lack of the right word, the blue-collar jobs. And nobody is actually doing much to uplift that finishing school infrastructure needed or the training infrastructure needed to create more capabilities there. The unemployment in that particular segment is much lower.
But sorry, just to add one thing. I think maybe that's one of the interesting differences from my observation between China and India. Because if we were talking about infrastructure in China, you'd probably know the numbers or you'd be more familiar. So there's a bit of just an awareness opportunity with some of the things that are going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's too little time, but there's also an execution problem, which is, but Rory, you get the last word. Does
organic industrial growth. All you guys are great. I didn't hear anything on consumer products. So we talk about these organic, all the industrial stuff that's going on, but now that you're the 5th largest economy, when do we start seeing the consumer products? How do we look at India from a consumer product perspective?
I mean,
Jay,
that's why you had a $20 billion investment by Walmart into Flipkart, right? Because there's this massive opportunity in consumer products. And that's why you see, not just big aspirations on e-commerce, but you see, Procter and Gamble and all of the major consumer products companies are in India, are very bullish on India, and see very bright futures in India.
well,
if I could just make a very sharp point. Look, I represent a group which pretty much does everything in the Indian economy, okay? other than the bad things. I think if strategically, if you are saying what is it we are looking at the next 20 years, I think we would be focusing very much more on the consumer market. We are betting on the Indian consumer in terms of what would be, its housing, its consumables, its transportation. Part of the reason we were originally a steel company, why we are expanding our steel capacity is again because we expect a big construction demand because of the infrastructure. But in all of this, in the totality of what we are doing, really targeting the Indian consumer is right up there in terms of where we are putting our money in the next 10 to 20 years.
it's also the largest market for Facebook, largest market for WhatsApp, more than likely will become the largest market for YouTube. So it's happening. It takes time, I guess. Okay, always difficult to do a session at the end of the day, but thank you guys for keeping it alive and fun, and thanks to the audience for showing up. Thank you very much.